Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey through the most epic and occasionally absurd deaths in history. Imagine you're walking through torchlit tombs, gliding past mummified rulers and shattered sarcophagi. Dust hangs thick in the air like time itself is holding its breath. A gold funeral mask stares at you with empty sockets, and somewhere deeper in the dark, a faint rattle of ancient chains echoes like a memory refusing to die. Yeah, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of the Nile, its waters a deep ink black under the moon. The year is around 1323 BCE, and the Egyptian Empire is still flexing its golden muscle. But behind all the obsidian statues and lotus-scented incense lies a rattling secret, the mysterious death of a boy king. Tutankhamun, barely a teenager when he took the throne, would rule for only about 9 years. Then he dropped dead under circumstances that still leave scholars rubbing their temples. You'd think dying young in ancient Egypt was just a sad footnote, but no. Tutankhamun's death becomes legendary not for how it happened, but for how it didn't make sense. No battle, no glory, just gone. And the autopsy, thousands of years later, not helpful. His mummy is in rough shape, like, did a backhoe dig him up? Rough. His sternum is missing, so are some ribs, his legs broken, his skull cracked. Theories start flying like locusts. Was it a chariot accident? That was the leading theory for a while. His body had injuries that could match a high-speed crash, though why a boy with a clubfoot and a cane was riding chariots is anyone's guess. Or maybe it was an infection? His left foot shows signs of necrosis. That's a very unroyal way to go. Others think it might have been malaria. That's right. You're the literal son of the sun god, and a mosquito still brings you down. But then things get weirder. CT scans in the early 2000s revealed Tut's chest cavity was literally missing, like no heart. In ancient Egyptian beliefs, that's catastrophic. The heart was the seat of the soul, weighed against a feather in the afterlife. No heart, no feather check. That's like deleting someone's Google account and changing the Wi-Fi password in the next world. Some fringe scholars wonder if it was a royal hit job. Tut's Vizier A swooped in real fast after his death, marrying his widow and claiming the throne like he had the crown on speed dial. And the tomb? It's oddly small and hastily prepared, more like a last-minute Airbnb than the eternal resting place of a god king. Historians still argue whether Tut's death was a tragic accident, a disease, or something a bit more Game of Thronesy. Let's not forget the curse angle, because what's a mummy without a little horror seasoning? When British archaeologist Howard Carter cracked open the tomb in 1922, weird stuff started happening. People on the expedition died in bizarre ways. Lord Carnarvon, who funded the dig, died of blood poisoning from a mosquito bite, yes, again with the mosquitoes, shortly after the tomb was opened. The media went wild, slapping a mummy's curse label on everything. And while modern experts chalk it up to coincidence, mold, or just ancient germs, you can't deny it adds flair. Now imagine the moment of death. Tutankhamun, barely 18, lying in his chambers, incense smoke curling toward the painted ceiling, priests whispering spells. Somewhere outside, a crocodile slides through the reeds, utterly uninterested. In that final breath, he leaves not just a life, but a mystery wrapped in linen, sealed with resin, and buried beneath 3,000 years of silence. Of course, he wouldn't be famous until millennia later. Irony, right? You die in a rush job of a tomb, and thousands of years down the line, you're a museum superstar. There's even a traveling exhibit with his stuff on tour, like some morbid rock band. And if you're wondering, yes, they did find a little dagger in his tomb made from meteoric iron. That's right, space metal. Because when you're a boy king destined for eternal speculation, even your pocket knife needs to come from the stars. You shuffle out of the desert tomb and into a sun-drenched plaza, marble underfoot, sandals slapping softly against the stone. Athens glows around you, proud and orderly, its columns rising like fluted exclamation points. But the city is uneasy tonight. Crowds whisper in the shadows, torches crackle with dry resignation, and you're standing at the edge of one of the most famous death scenes in Western philosophy. Socrates, the man who asked too many questions, is about to drink a cup of hemlock, and you're here for every bittersweet drop. He's not panicking, not begging, not even pacing. He's just sitting in his cell, chatting with his students like it's book club night. One of them is crying, another's fidgeting. And Socrates, calm as a cucumber dipped in stoic resolve. It's 399 BCE, and Athens is nursing a bad hangover from its loss to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. Things are tense. Paranoia runs high. And Socrates, who's been going around town poking holes in everyone's beliefs, becomes an easy target. Officially, he's convicted of impiety and corrupting the youth. Unofficially, people are probably just tired of being out-debated by a guy in a toga. He could have escaped. Seriously, his friends tried to bribe the guards. There was even a plan to sneak him out of the city. But nope, Socrates insists on sticking around. The law is the law, he says, even when it's kind of dumb. Historians still argue whether he chose death as a philosophical statement or was just being stubborn to the bitter end. And that bitter end? It's literally bitter. Hemlock isn't a fun way to go. It paralyzes you from the legs up. First, your toes go numb, then your calves, then your chest, and finally, when it hits your lungs, lights out. No drama, no screaming, just silence as your body forgets how to breathe. You can almost hear the scratch of a quill nearby, Plato scribbling the whole thing down like a diligent intern. And that's how we know what we know, from one student's memory of his teacher's final moments. According to Plato, Socrates makes a few jokes before drinking the poison. One about how he owes a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, which is both ironic and poetic. Healing through death, or maybe just his way of saying, thanks for the ride. Here's the thing. Some fringe theorists whisper that maybe Socrates didn't drink poison at all. One old theory suggests he could have been slowly poisoned over time with lead or other substances, that the hemlock was just theater. Others think Plato might have embellished a little for dramatic effect. I mean, wouldn't you if your philosophical hero died in front of you? And speaking of drama, did you know that Athenian executions weren't usually so elegant? Most criminals were exiled, enslaved, or executed more violently. Socrates got the deluxe exit package. Why? Probably because people still respected him, even as they voted to kill him. Athenian democracy, now with 500 jurors and a dash of moral confusion. Picture Socrates now, sitting with his students in that stuffy prison chamber, calmly sipping a drink that's about to end his life. You watch his breathing slow, his legs stiffen. The conversation never stops. He's still teaching, still nudging his disciples toward that one big, uncomfortable truth. that wisdom begins when you admit you don't know squat. And just like that, he's gone. No epic battlefield, no divine thunderbolt, just a man accepting his fate in the most inconveniently virtuous way possible. Centuries later, his death will echo through classrooms and dorm rooms, often quoted and occasionally misunderstood. Modern philosophers cite him as the ultimate martyr for free speech. Some rebellious teenagers even put his quotes on Instagram, usually between gym selfies and latte pics. Legacy secured. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Hemlock, the same plant that iced Socrates, isn't just historical. It still grows today in fields and ditches across Europe and North America, harmless looking, like parsley's sinister cousin. In fact, people have accidentally confused it with edible herbs. So if you ever go foraging, double check your greenery. And here's your final image. A quiet cell, lit by oil lamps, flickering shadows on stone walls, a clay cup resting on the floor. Outside, Athens stirs, unsure whether it's just executed a troublemaker or lost its conscience. You exhale slowly, and the torchlight dances just a little softer. You step into the dust-choked streets of Alexandria, where the air is thick with the scent of papyrus, salt from the nearby sea, and the faint tang of unrest. The city's grand library, a towering labyrinth of knowledge, stands like a beacon of light against the twilight of the ancient world. But tonight, you're here not to admire its scrolls, but to witness the tragic final act of Hypatia, the last great pagan philosopher and mathematician of Alexandria. Imagine her, a woman in a world ruled by men, fearless and brilliant, teaching Neoplatonic philosophy to eager students. She's tall, dignified, with eyes sharp enough to pierce through the fog of ignorance. But Alexandria in the 4th century CE is no longer the scholarly utopia it once was. Tensions between the Christian majority and pagan intellectuals are boiling over like a pot left unattended on the fire. Hypatia's end is not just a death. It's a symbolic annihilation of the classical wisdom that had survived millennia. You can almost hear the angry mob's jeers, blending with the crashing of furniture and the tearing of pages. They drag her from her carriage, ripping at her clothes and skin, until finally they murder her with shards of broken pottery and oyster shells, the ancient world's version of DIY torture tools. Historians still argue whether the religious zealotry was the sole cause or if political power plays in the city's chaotic leadership also fanned the flames. Now here's a quirky detail. Hypatia is often said to have invented the hydrometer, a device that measures the density of liquids, basically the original hipster science gadget of her time. And although her writings don't survive, her legacy survived in the minds of scholars, whispered like a ghost haunting the ruins of reason. The destruction of Hypatia signals more than the loss of one woman. It's the symbolic death of pagan philosophy, the decline of the Alexandrian library's influence, and a turning point where knowledge begins to be shrouded by dogma and fear. Some scholars argue that had Hypatia's voice prevailed, the Dark Ages might have been less dark. You close your eyes and picture that brutal scene, the crowd's rage mixing with the city's melancholy, and yet there's a strange kind of immortality in her death. She becomes a martyr, not just of philosophy, but of intellectual freedom itself. And while the library's scrolls may have burned, the ideas Hypatia championed flicker on, hidden in the recesses of history waiting to be rediscovered. And hey, remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from our Egyptian chapter? Well, Alexandria's scholars probably had their own equally questionable beauty and health secrets, one of them being the use of crushed pearls for eye medicine. Imagine rubbing that in your eyes daily. No wonder some people looked like they were perpetually squinting at the horizon. In the end, Hypatia's death is a lesson in the fragility of knowledge and the brutal price of progress, or the lack of it. The city that once housed the world's greatest library watches its last guardian fall, the silence afterward louder than any scream. You find yourself swept into the swirling mists of ancient China, the land of towering walls, shadowy forests, and a relentless quest for immortality. The year is 210 BCE, and the first emperor of a unified China, Qin Shi Huang, sits atop his throne. Yet his mind is consumed not with ruling the world, but with escaping death itself. This guy is the original fear of dying poster child. He's already crushed rival states, built the first iteration of what will become the Great Wall, and standardized currency and language. But despite all that, he's utterly obsessed with the idea that death is the ultimate boss level, one he's desperate not to face. He sends out expeditions looking for mythical islands and potions to grant eternal life. The irony? Historians still argue whether these very efforts, including his obsession with mercury pills, might have sped up his demise. Picture this: an emperor swallowing glowing pills made from mercury and other heavy metals, hoping for immortality, while actually poisoning himself one dose at a time. His death at 49 is swift but shrouded in mystery. Was it natural? Or did the emperor's quest for eternal life lead him to a premature grave? Some fringe historians suggest palace intrigue might have played a role too, because, spoiler alert, no dynasty survives without a little backstabbing. And here's a quirky fact you probably didn't expect. Qin Shi Huang's tomb isn't just a grave. It's basically an underground palace, complete with life-size terracotta warriors. Over 8,000 of them stand guard, frozen in silent battle formations, armed and terrifying. It's like the world's first and creepiest wax museum. And fun fact, they were all individually sculpted, with unique faces, hairstyles, and expressions. If ancient China had a most wanted lineup, these terracotta soldiers would be it. Now imagine the emperor's death. No triumphant last words, no grand farewell. Just a secret kept by a few courtiers who hid his death from the public for months to avoid chaos. His tomb, meanwhile, remained untouched, rumored to be booby-trapped with rivers of mercury and crossbows ready to shoot intruders. Scientists today have detected high mercury levels around the site, proving these legends weren't just tall tales. Qin Shi Huang's death marks the beginning of the end for his dynasty, and his obsession with immortality ironically cements his legacy, not as the eternal ruler he wished to be, but as a cautionary tale of human hubris. The quest for immortality, it seems, often ends in very mortal consequences. Here's a strange little side note. Some reports claim that the emperor's craftsmen crafted a model of the entire empire inside his tomb, complete with flowing mercury rivers to represent actual waterways. It's like the ultimate diorama, but with deadly metal. Modern archaeologists still debate whether this was a visionary tribute or a bizarre attempt to control the afterlife. So as you stand on the edge of this ancient tomb, hearing the faint creak of clay soldiers settling into eternal silence, you're reminded of how death has always been the final conqueror, even for emperors who dared to chase forever. You're trudging through jagged mountain passes blanketed in snow, the biting cold cutting through your cloak like 1,000 needles. Somewhere out here in the Alps, a legend is born, not of kings or philosophers, but of an unstoppable warlord leading an army with elephants. This is Hannibal Barca, Carthaginian general extraordinaire, and his death is as epic as his campaigns. Hannibal's march over the Alps is the stuff of legends. Treacherous terrain, freezing temperatures, and surprise attacks on the Romans who thought the mountains were impenetrable. His elephants, ancient tanks with tusks and trunks, lumber through the snow, terrifying enemies and inspiring allies. But after years of brutal warfare, defeat finally catches up to him. Picture Hannibal's final days, not on a battlefield, but in exile. After fleeing Rome's relentless pursuit, he finds refuge in courts far from home, first with the Macedonians, then the Seleucids. Yet the Romans keep closing in, and Hannibal knows the noose tightens. Historians still argue whether he chose to poison himself or was assassinated by Roman agents. Either way, the image is striking, a general who defied Rome's might, ending his life on his own terms, away from the glory and bloodshed he once commanded. Here's a quirky twist. Despite the elephants' fearsome reputation, they weren't the war machines you might imagine. They often got spooked and slipped on rocks or panicked under fire, sometimes causing chaos for their own side. Yet they remain one of the most unforgettable parts of Hannibal's military genius. Imagine Hannibal's final moments. A man weary from years of war, watching the sun set over a foreign land, clutching a small vial of poison or a dagger hidden beneath his cloak. No triumphant return home, no parade of victory, just silence and the cold wind carrying the distant echoes of battles long past. And that poison? Legend says it was a concoction passed down through his family, a last resort for a warrior who refused to be captured. The exact recipe is lost to time, but it adds a touch of mythic drama to a death already wrapped in mystery. You might be wondering, how did a general so feared and admired just disappear like that? Well, exile was often worse than death in those days. Stripped of power and surrounded by enemies, Hannibal's only escape was through death's door. So as you stand on that snowy pass, the ghost of the war elephants trumpeting faintly in your ears, remember that sometimes the most epic deaths happen far from the battlefield's roar. You wander into the smoky, crowded streets of Renaissance Florence, where the smell of ink, fresh bread, and burning candles swirl through the air. Artists, scholars, and politicians buzz with nervous energy, aware that the winds of power shift with frightening speed. And here, in the middle of it all, stands Giuliano de' Medici, the unlucky younger brother of Lorenzo the Magnificent, about to meet a death so brutal it still echoes through the marble halls of Palazzo Vecchio. The year is 1478, and Florence is on edge. The Pazzi family, rivals hungry for power, have plotted a bloody coup. You're in the Duomo, the giant cathedral where the Medici brothers attend Mass. Suddenly, chaos erupts. Daggers flash in the sunlight, screams cut through prayers, and blood splatters the holy floor. Giuliano is stabbed 19 times, dying within minutes, while Lorenzo barely escapes with his life. Historians still argue whether the Pazzi conspiracy was purely political or fueled by deeper personal vendettas. The audacity of attacking the Medici during Mass shocked everyone. Imagine the scene: sacred space violated, the smell of incense drowned by iron and fear. Here's a quirky tidbit. One of the conspirators was actually a priest who betrayed his own altar. Religious double-crossing was definitely a thing. And after the attack, the Medici loyalists didn't waste time. Florence erupted in a violent purge, turning the city into a boiling pot of revenge and paranoia. Giuliano's death is the textbook definition of dying in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was popular, charismatic, and known for throwing lavish parties. But that night, all those qualities meant nothing. It's ironic that the younger brother, often overshadowed by Lorenzo's brilliance, became the tragic martyr that fueled the Medici's later dominance. And here's your eyebrow raiser. Some sources say Giuliano's body was so mutilated it was barely recognizable, prompting rumors he might have survived the attack briefly and witnessed the chaos of his brother's escape. Whether true or not, the image adds a haunting human layer to the political thriller. The aftermath? Florence's political landscape reshaped forever. The Pazzi were hunted down and executed with brutal efficiency, their names forever tarnished in history. The Medici, ironically, emerged stronger, their grip on Florence firmer than ever. So you stand amid the rubble of sacred betrayal, feeling the weight of power struggles that turned churches into battlegrounds and brotherhood into bloodshed. Giuliano's death reminds us that in history, the line between worship and war can be thinner than a dagger's blade. You step onto the soggy, muddy ground of a 17th century battlefield somewhere in Europe, gun smoke swirling, horses neighing, the cries of men mingling with the distant roar of cannons. This is the 30 Years' War, a brutal conflict that tore the continent apart like a wild beast. And at the center of this chaos stands the legendary King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, a military genius whose death will shake the world. It's 1632, and Gustavus has stormed into Germany, leading his troops against the Catholic forces. You can almost feel the cold drizzle soaking through your cloak as the Battle of Lutzen unfolds, a foggy, chaotic clash where the king's leadership is crucial. But fate plays a cruel trick. In the confusion, Gustavus is struck down by enemy fire, shot through the shoulder. The wound seems manageable, but the king disappears into the fog, his body later found lifeless on the field. Historians still argue whether his death was due to enemy action or an accident caused by his own soldiers accidentally shooting him. Some fringe accounts even suggest he might have died from exposure as the battlefield's freezing mist seeped into his wound. Whatever the cause, his death leaves a power vacuum that alters the course of the war. Now here's a quirky detail. Gustavus was known as the Lion of the North, but he also had a fondness for inventing battlefield gadgets. He's credited with pioneering lighter, more mobile artillery, and even using coordinated infantry tactics that revolutionized warfare. In a way, he died while embodying the very innovation he brought to war. Imagine the soldiers' shock when their fearless leader falls. They reportedly covered his body with their own cloaks to hide it from the enemy. A humble yet heroic gesture. It's one of those rare moments in history when a king dies on the battlefield rather than safe behind walls or on a throne. And speaking of drama, some stories say Gustavus's body was smuggled out in a coffin lined with lead to protect it from being desecrated by enemy forces, because the dude was that important. The king's death galvanized Protestant forces, but also marked the beginning of a long, bloody struggle that wouldn't end for another 16 years. In a weirdly poetic twist, the king who modernized warfare fell victim to the unpredictable chaos of battle itself. A reminder that even the greatest warriors are mortal. Picture the fog lifting from the battlefield, revealing a silent king lying still while the war rages on around him. So, as you trudge through that cold mist, hearing distant gunfire and the whispered prayers of soldiers, you realize that some deaths echo far beyond their moment, shaping history, inspiring legends, and reminding us all of the fragile line between life and legacy. You're walking the narrow cobblestone streets of 16th century England, where the smell of smoke from hearth fires mingles with the tense whispers of political intrigue. The Tudor dynasty is locked in a dangerous dance of power, and you find yourself at the doorstep of one of its most infamous deaths, that of Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, wife of Henry VIII, and mother of Elizabeth Thirst. It's May 19th, 1536, and Anne stands in the Tower of London, accused of treason, adultery, and witchcraft. Whether these charges were true or just convenient lies cooked up to remove her remains debated by historians. Some argue she was a victim of Henry's desire to remarry. Others say she was a pawn in a deadly court game. What's clear is that her death is as swift as it is shocking. You can almost feel the chill in the air as Anne is led to the scaffold, her hands bound, her red gown stark against the gray stone. The executioner, unusually for England, uses a French-style sword, sharp and precise. One clean stroke, and Anne's head is severed in a single blow, sparing her the gruesome ordeal of the axe. Here's a quirky fact. Anne's executioner was supposedly an expert swordsman from France, brought in to ensure the queen's death was as quick and merciful as possible. In a grim twist of irony, Anne's stepdaughter Elizabeth would later ascend the throne and preside over an era of relative stability and prosperity. Imagine the crowd watching silently, some horrified, others relieved, as the queen's body is carried away. The execution is a political message wrapped in tragedy, Henry's ruthless reminder that no one, not even a queen, is untouchable. Anne's death also sends a chilling ripple through the court, making it clear that loyalty is a fragile thing. And in a bizarre detail, some accounts suggest Anne had a peculiar sense of humor, even in her final moments, reportedly making a joke about her fate to calm the guards. That biting wit would become part of her enduring legend. Historians still debate the true nature of her trial and execution. Was it justice or a miscarriage? Was she truly guilty, or just a casualty of Henry's infamous divorce and conquer policy? The truth is probably lost beneath centuries of gossip and propaganda. As you stand where Anne's blood once soaked the cold stone, you realize her death was more than just a royal execution. It was the violent intersection of love, power, and survival. And the echo of her story still lingers, reminding us how precarious life could be when the throne's at stake. You're swept into the eerie corridors of the ancient Japanese samurai culture, where honor is life's currency and death on the battlefield is only part of the story. Here you encounter the haunting last moments of the legendary samurai Miyamoto Musashi, a swordsman whose death is as mysterious and poetic as his life. Musashi died in 1645, supposedly of natural causes, but his final days were anything but ordinary. After decades of dueling and wandering Japan's countryside, he retired to a cave to write his famous treatise, The Book of Five Rings, a timeless guide on strategy and philosophy. You can almost smell the ink blending with the earthy dampness of his retreat as he scrawls his last words, pondering life and death. Yet, historians still argue about whether Musashi actually died peacefully or chose to end his life through ritual suicide or seppuku. The lack of contemporary records leaves room for speculation. Some fringe theories even propose he faked his death to escape enemies, vanishing into obscurity. One quirky detail: Musashi was ambidextrous and could wield two swords at once. Talk about multitasking. He was undefeated in over 60 duels, earning a reputation as an unstoppable force. And he wasn't just a warrior, he was a painter and calligrapher, a Renaissance man of the samurai world. Imagine Musashi's last moments, alone in that damp cave, the ink drying on his manuscript, reflecting on a life spent mastering the blade in mind. Whether he closed his eyes naturally or through a deliberate act, his death feels like the final stroke of a brush painting a perfect ending. Some scholars debate if his death marked the end of an era of wandering swordsmen or simply the passing of one extraordinary soul. His writings would influence martial arts and strategy for centuries, a legacy that outlived even the sharpest sword. And here's a fun twist. Musashi reportedly fought his final duel while ill and weak, proving that even in decline, his spirit was indomitable. He embodied the samurai ideal until the very end. As you leave that quiet cave, the echo of his footsteps fading in the mist, you realize his death wasn't just the end of a man, but the quiet close of a legendary chapter in Japanese history. a reminder that the greatest battles sometimes happen within. You find yourself in the candlelit halls of the French Revolution, the air thick with the scent of sweat, fear, and cheap wine. The year is 1793, and the notorious guillotine has become the grim symbol of justice, or terror, depending on who you ask. Among its many victims, one death stands out for its mixture of tragedy, spectacle, and the slow crumbling of an empire. The execution of Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France before the monarchy's fall. Imagine Marie, dressed in simple gray, her hair cut short as a mark of humiliation, stepping onto the scaffold with an air of reluctant dignity. The crowd jeers and murmurs, the sounds of revolution echoing off the stone buildings. Her fate is sealed, accused of everything from treason to squandering the nation's wealth. Historians still argue whether her trial was a sham designed to justify the revolutionaries' fury or a fair process by the chaotic standards of the time. Here's a quirky and almost surreal detail. Marie Antoinette's last words were reportedly to the executioner, asking him to be quick and gentle. Imagine the queen of lavish palaces humbling herself to that extent, a tragic end to a life once filled with silk gowns and glittering balls. The guillotine's blade falls swiftly, severing the head that wore the iconic powdered wig, and the crowd's reaction is a mix of relief, shock, and grim satisfaction. Her death is a pivotal moment, symbolizing the irreversible end of the Ancien regime and the terrifying birth pangs of modern France. And speaking of spectacle, some eyewitnesses claim that Marie Antoinette maintained a calm and even serene demeanor right until the end, contrasting sharply with the violent frenzy around her. This calmness turned her into a martyr figure for royalists and a cautionary tale for revolutionaries. Historians still debate how much Marie Antoinette's image was shaped by propaganda. Was she the frivolous, heartless Madame Deficit, or a misunderstood queen caught in the tides of history? The truth is probably a complex blend of both. As you stand in that bustling square, hearing the roar of the crowd and feeling the chill of a blade falling, you realize Marie's death wasn't just the end of a person, but the violent punctuation mark in a story of revolution, justice, and change. It's a reminder that sometimes history's most epic deaths happen in the glare of the public eye, turning individuals into legends, willing or not. You're transported to the bleak, icy expanse of Siberia in the early 20th century, where the chill of revolution bites as fiercely as the wind. Here unfolds the tragic and enigmatic death of Grigory Rasputin, the mystic who clawed his way into the heart of the Russian imperial family and into history's annals for one of the most bizarre and debated deaths ever. It's the night of December 16th, 1916. Rasputin, invited to a nobleman's palace under the guise of friendship, enters a room thick with tension and suspicion. He's been accused of manipulating Serena Alexandra and contributing to Russia's downfall. According to legend, his assassins first poison him with cyanide-laced cakes and wine. When that fails to kill him, they shoot him multiple times, beat him, and finally throw his body into the icy Niva River. Historians still argue about what really happened. Did he actually survive the poison and gunshots long enough to drown? Some forensic evidence disputes parts of the story, but the myth persists because it perfectly fits Rasputin's almost supernatural reputation. Here's a quirky bit. Rasputin was said to have hypnotic eyes that could entrance people, a rumor that made him a figure of fear and fascination. And despite his often scandalous reputation, some say he genuinely helped heal the heir to the throne, Tsarevich Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. Imagine the wild scene, the flicker of candlelight, whispered conspiracies, the desperate attempts to end a man's life who seemed almost impossible to kill. It's like something out of a Gothic novel, with Rasputin playing both villain and victim. The aftermath of his death was immediate chaos. The Russian Empire was already unraveling, and Rasputin's assassination did little to save the monarchy, which would collapse less than a year later during the Bolshevik Revolution. And here's the darkly amusing twist. Some reports say Rasputin's last words were a curse on those who killed him, words that seemed eerily prophetic as Russia plunged into chaos soon after. As you imagine that frozen river, its surface now silent, you feel the chilling echo of a man whose death was as epic and enigmatic as his life. Rasputin's story reminds us how myth and reality often collide in the grandest exits from history. You're stepping into the smoky, jazz-filled speakeasies of 1920 Chicago, where the air crackles with danger and the scent of whiskey. This is the era of gangsters, bootleggers, and legends who ruled the underworld with iron fists. And one death stands out above the rest, that of Al Capone, America's most infamous mob boss. Capone's demise isn't the fiery shootout you might expect, but a slow, painful decline. After years of running Chicago's criminal empire with ruthless efficiency, he's finally convicted of tax evasion in 1931. A surprise blow delivered not by bullets, but by the law. He serves time in the notorious Alcatraz prison, where his health deteriorates rapidly. Historians still argue about whether Capone's downfall was due to his enemies plotting or just the relentless pursuit by federal agents determined to take down the gangster kingpin. What's clear is that after his release, Capone is a shadow of his former self, suffering from advanced syphilis that ravages his brain. Here's a quirky fact. Despite his violent reputation, Capone was known for throwing lavish Christmas parties for orphans and donating to charity. Talk about complicated legacies. It's the kind of paradox that makes historical figures endlessly fascinating. Imagine Capone, once a terrifying figure who commanded respect and fear, now confined to a wheelchair, confused and frail, his mind slipping away while the city he ruled moves on without him. His death in 1947 from a stroke and pneumonia feels almost anticlimactic compared to the bloody battles of his youth. Some scholars debate whether his illness was exacerbated by his lifestyle or if his psychological decline was inevitable given the brutal world he inhabited. Either way, his slow fading is a stark contrast to the violent ends many of his contemporaries met. And here's your sleepy irony. The gangster who evaded countless assassination attempts is finally undone by a disease, one nobody tried to kill him with. It's a reminder that sometimes the most epic deaths are quiet and unexpected. As you sit in that dim prison cell, the distant sounds of jazz and sirens mingling, you feel the weight of a life lived at full throttle and a death that sneaks in like a whisper in the night. You're drawn into the smoky corridors of 1930s Germany, where the heavy scent of propaganda mixes with whispers of ambition and fear. This is the story of Ernst Röhm, one of the Nazi Party's earliest leaders and the head of the Sturmabteilung, SA, whose death marked a chilling turning point in Hitler's consolidation of power. It's June 30th, 1934, the night known as the Night of the Long Knives. Röhm, once a close ally of Hitler and the architect of the SA's rise, has fallen out of favor. Accused of plotting a coup, he is arrested and taken to Stadelheim prison in Munich. Despite his pleas, the executioner's bullets end his life in the early hours. Historians still argue whether Röhm was truly plotting against Hitler or if his death was simply a ruthless power play to appease the German military and political elites. What's undeniable is that this purge eliminated dozens of perceived threats and secured Hitler's iron grip on Germany. Here's a quirky detail. Röhm was known for his flamboyant style and openly homosexual lifestyle, something that both scandalized and complicated his position within the Nazi hierarchy. His death not only silenced a political rival, but also served as a brutal warning to anyone stepping out of line. Imagine the tension in that prison cell, the sound of footsteps, the cold steel of handcuffs, the stark silence before the shots ring out. Röhm's death was less a battlefield drama and more a sinister, shadowy act of betrayal. Some scholars debate whether the Night of the Long Knives was a necessary evil for Hitler or a monstrous crime that foreshadowed the horrors to come. The event remains a chilling example of political murder disguised as justice. And here's the darkly ironic twist. Röhm's SA, once a formidable force, was brutally dismantled shortly after his death, showing how quickly allies can become enemies in ruthless power struggles. As you leave that grim prison, the echoes of whispered betrayals and fatal gunshots still linger, reminding you that in history the most epic deaths aren't always on the battlefield. They sometimes happen in the shadows of politics, sealed by silence and fear. You're thrust into the humid, war-torn jungles of Vietnam in the 1960s, the distant thud of helicopters blending with the buzz of cicadas. Here unfolds the death of Nguyen Van Lem, known as Captain Bai Lup, a figure whose brutal end became a chilling symbol of the Vietnam War's cruelty and complexity. Captured by South Vietnamese forces, Lem is accused of leading Viet Cong guerrillas responsible for massacres. His fate is sealed in a photograph that will shock the world. General Nguyen Ngoc Loan, the South Vietnamese chief of police, executes Lem on the spot with a pistol shot to the head during the Tet Offensive of 1968. Historians still argue about the morality and legality of this execution. Was it an act of wartime necessity, or a war crime that exemplified the moral ambiguity of conflict. The image itself became an iconic piece of photojournalism, influencing public opinion and anti-war sentiment worldwide. Here's a quirky detail that might surprise you. The photographer Eddie Adams later expressed deep regret over the photograph's impact, feeling it oversimplified a complex war and unfairly painted the general as a villain. Imagine the moment, the sudden flash of the camera, the shocked silence, the violent finality of the act. It's a death captured not just in time, but in the raw, unfiltered emotion of war. Some scholars debate how this single image shaped the narrative of the Vietnam War, sparking protests and political debates far beyond the battlefield. It's a potent reminder of how death can become a powerful symbol. And here's the haunting irony. While Lem's death was swift, it became a slow-burning catalyst for societal upheaval back home, proving that the impact of a death often stretches far beyond the immediate moment. As you step back from that jungle clearing, the heavy air tinged with gunpowder and regret, you realize that some deaths, frozen in a photograph, become immortal, not just in history books, but in the collective consciousness of humanity. You find yourself in the sterile, brightly lit room of a spacecraft hurtling through the vast emptiness of space, a place far removed from the earthly battlefields and courts you've visited so far. Here, you confront the death of Yuri Gagarin, the first human to orbit Earth, a death both tragic and shrouded in mystery, marking the end of a pioneer's journey. It's March 27, 1968. Gagarin is piloting a MiG-15 jet on a routine training flight near Moscow when his plane crashes, killing him instantly. The official reports say it was a mid-air collision or pilot error, but historians and conspiracy theorists alike still argue about the true cause. Was it a mechanical failure, an evasive maneuver to avoid another aircraft, or something more sinister? Here's a quirky detail. Gagarin was known for his infectious smile and charisma, earning him the nickname the People's Cosmonaut. His death shocked the Soviet Union and the world, snuffing out the life of a man who symbolized human curiosity and courage. Imagine the silence after the crash, the quiet sobs of a nation mourning a hero, and the void left by the first person to glimpse our planet from beyond the clouds. His death wasn't in space, but brought the cosmic dream crashing down to Earth. Some scholars debate the extent to which Gagarin's death impacted the Soviet space program's momentum. Did it slow down their exploration, or fuel a renewed drive to conquer space? And here's a bittersweet twist. Gagarin lived his dream of orbiting Earth but never got to see humanity reach the moon, a milestone just a year after his death. It's a reminder that some pioneers blaze trails, others follow. As you stand at the crash site, surrounded by whispering trees and distant stars, you feel the weight of a life that touched the heavens but ended too soon. His legacy lives on in every rocket launched and every star gazed at from Earth, reminding us that even in death, the human spirit reaches for the infinite. Awaiting final wind-down command or any further instructions.